Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. Hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. So we welcome author and historian Rustam Alexander to discuss his book, Red Closet, The Hidden History of Gay Oppression in the USSR. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, hey Jackson, thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here.
No worries. I'm really excited to talk about a different area of Soviet history, a point that we don't really talk about that much at all, to be honest.
You see, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, this is not a popular topic in Soviet and Russian history as well. Regrettably, most scholars in the field, they don't actually think that this is a serious topic that should, merit some historical investigation. And that's really unfortunate. So the thing that you've said is 100% right.
Can I ask why they don't think it's an area to talk about?
I think there is a certain perception that the issue of homosexuality is related to medicine, gender, and all these other categories that are somehow considered alien to Russian historical tradition. So I even remember that exchange that one of the pioneering scholars of Russian history and homosexuality, Dan Healy, mentioned that he had this exchange with one distinguished Russian historian who said to him, "Hey, why are you writing about gays, basically? Don't you think that medical professionals should actually, talk about that rather than historians?" And Dan Healy told him, "No, I disagree with this view, and I actually think that historical investigation into these medical practices will give us a better insight about Russian and Soviet history." So there is this strong opposition to looking at things like medical science, homosexuality, transsexuality from a historical perspective. And many historians, unfortunately, Russian historians at least, they come from the Soviet Union. And perhaps they were somehow this Soviet indoctrination rubbed off on them to some extent, and they kind of imbibed these homophobic attitudes. Even though they think that they're not homophobic, they still have these deeply ingrained homophobic attitudes to the issue of homosexuality as a historical subject. So they think that it's a trivial issue, that, they actually trivialize it. They think that this is something that will not tell us anything. But they are missing the point, because the issue of sexuality, homosexuality, is something that can tell us a lot about the power dynamics within any society. And these are all highly sensitive and political issues, especially in Russia today. So if 20 years ago the issue of homosexuality was something unpopular, today it's actually a dangerous issue that has, and those scholars who wish to write something about that, they actually run the actual risk of, being put away in prison. So that's an interesting thing. But this reluctance to engage with the issue on a more serious level has existed since the collapse of the Soviet Union, unfortunately. And that's very regrettable, because, it is very regrettable because it makes the existing historical narrative a bit reductive, and if you compare to the historical scholarship, in the West, it's far more sophisticated, and, it's just more sophisticated from a historical point of view. That's what I can tell you as a historian, and it's very unfortunate. And I think, and here we are, like me and other scholars, we are working hard to do something about that, to derail this, well, not to derail, but to God, I can't find the right word, to break this tradition of silencing voices. Because if all scholars start looking at the issue of homosexuality in the context of Russian history more seriously, they will understand the motives behind many decisions. Perhaps they will find more answers as to why these people did that and that person did that. Because sexuality is something that drives us, our decisions, our decision making on a very, and it comes from that intimate thing. And unfortunately, many Russian historians fail to understand that. And I think that will be, in the future, that is something that will be rectified. We'll do that. We'll take care of it.
Yeah, and I'm finding it particularly interesting how you're wanting to challenge how history is being used to kind of cement an ideological view in Russia.
Yeah.
Did that inspire you to write the book?
Yes. So that's exactly why I wrote Red Closet. Red Closet is my second book. So the first book is called Regulating Homosexuality in Soviet Russia, A Different History. It's an academic monograph, and its it was intended for academics, for scholars, for serious scholars, professors, and people somehow affiliated with universities. And I thought that even though that was a book, but it was not enough to achieve the goal of reaching out to people and making them think and making them realize that actually Russian queer history is a thing. Russian queer history is something that not is it only fascinating, but it is very instructive. It can give us so much insight into what is happening today. And I thought, what a pity if all this interesting stuff that I uncovered and found will be, restricted only to academic environments, circles, and discussions. People in Russia, they need to know that this is something really urgent. And I felt that. And I realized that that was going to be something important. And when I wrote the book in English, I got in touch with a Russian publisher and I told them that, hey, I've written this book in English. And they were like, oh, wow, why did you write it in English? And I said, hey, because I thought that you would never publish it. And they translated it immediately. We published it. We sold it. Like, they sold maybe, I think, more than 5,000 copies in December 2022. And then Putin signed a new law banning all LGBTQ propaganda, which means any positive discussions of the issue of homosexuality. So my book was basically made illegal. It's still being sold somewhere in Russia, but it's still something dangerous. So basically, by writing Red Closet, I wanted to reach out to wider audiences, people who may not be familiar with Soviet history, but who may be still curious about homosexual existence in the Soviet Union. And judging by the stuff that people write on Goodreads, I think I've reached some of them, and and I'm glad I did. So that is the goal.
I think it was really interesting how you were able to touch on loads of different periods of Soviet history and kind of break down misconceptions that we have about that period. And particularly one aspect that I found interesting is I think we tend to have this misconception about the Great Terror, Stalin's purges of the 30s, as being kind of indiscriminate numbers on paper, maybe a few names. So I kind of want to ask, what was the attitude towards homosexuality under Stalin, but then how did it play into the Great Terror of the 30s?
Look, well, so in 1934, Stalin made sodomy illegal. That was not the time of the Great Terror yet, but the persecution of homosexual men, not women, became part of that Great Terror picture of the Great Terror thing. And it's actually interesting again, Russian historians, they do not want to recognize that men who were imprisoned under these Stalin's sodomy laws, that they were actually victims of political repressions. So they do not want to recognize them as the victims of the Great Terror. Can you believe that? Because they're like, oh, these are homosexuals. That is a completely different issue. So definitely, so the crime of sodomy was basically introduced. Well, not the crime of sodomy. The sodomy law was introduced in 1934, and it's actually it's a period that most historians understand only in very sketchy terms, because we don't have many sources, we don't have much hard evidence to actually say a definitive, like to come to definitive conclusions. All we know is that, yes, once the law was in place in Moscow, Leningrad, and other major cities, there were entrapments and there were criminal cases opened against homosexual men. We don't know how many exactly, because we don't have that stats. And even if we do, it's very fragmented, and we're not sure if it's, if it's basically, if we can trust that. So this topic, this time in the Soviet history still requires a lot of investigation. So in my book, I think I just touched the tip of the iceberg, honestly, because many more books can be written about this period. And definitely the prosecution of male homosexuality, was part of this Great Terror. People suffered, they were put away, they were imprisoned, and we don't know much about that period. We don't even know at this point, we don't even know the genuine reasons why Stalin decided to criminalize homosexuality. Yes, we theorize. Yes, we know that the boss, like what was his name, the chief of OGPU, the Soviet secret police, pitched the idea to him. But there may have been some other reasons why he decided to do that. Why he decided to do that in 1934. And yes, the whole thing, the suppression of sexuality and homosexuality was logical, because Stalin wanted people to work. People wanted to participate in industrialization, collectivization. He basically wanted that to work and, make families, make babies, and not he didn't want them to be distracted by things like sex, even more so homosexual sex, because in his view homosexual sex was useless, because it didn't lead to procreation, it didn't serve any purpose, so it just distracted people from socialist aspirations. So, and that was the main. So when the chief of Stalin's secret police explained what was wrong with homosexuality, he said that they were corrupting our young soldiers, they were corrupting our officers, and they were so insidious that they were even working for Nazis, like all that kind of stuff. And Stalin was really paranoid, and it played into his paranoia. And perhaps maybe that is another reason why he decided to enact this law. But again, this is a very not shady, what's the word? Murky. That is a very, it's still an uncharted territory for historians wanting to investigate why homosexuality was enacted. I don't have definitive answers, so I just wanted my readers to have an idea of what it was like, of what it maybe felt like, in very general terms, And I'm sure there will be more historical work on this topic that will probably challenge something that I've written. I'm glad if something like that happens. I will be glad. But that's a very interesting period that I'm myself curious about.
I think it's quite interesting there. You touched upon the lack of sources.
Mm-hmm.
Being a totalitarian regime, they deliberately make the waters murky and make it difficult for you to understand. But you mentioned one thing there about the sodomy laws, and sodomy laws being incredibly specific of criminalizing straight old men's homosexual relationships. But you mentioned that they don't criminalize lesbian relationships. What was the social attitudes towards the two types of relationships in Russia?
So first of all, during Stalinist times, nobody talked about sex. Nobody talked about homosexuality. Like, I think people didn't even use the word homosexuality. The language, yeah, this like that modern language, sex, homosexuality, I think it came into the Soviet Union maybe in the 60s or something like that. So under Stalin, people didn't talk about sex at all. Yeah, so again, it's very difficult to gauge what the like. I mean, we simply don't have the data. Yeah, what the attitudes towards homosexuality were. Yes, we know that it was a crime. Yes, we know that some men got caught. Yeah, and we also know that Stalin, we know that there were no laws criminalizing lesbianism. Some scholars believe that because not gay men, yeah, homosexual men who had sex with other men, they met in visible places like bars and public toilets and parks. They were more visible to Stalin's secret police. So that's why they caught their attention. And that's why they created this impression that there were many of them. Yeah. And that's why Stalin and his cronies believed, oh, that's a big problem. So they didn't see lesbian women meeting each other in the streets. Yeah. They didn't see their, parties. They didn't see them, cruising the streets. So they probably thought, that's a thing that does not merit our attention, probably because it's not as widespread as male homosexuality. And also, all of them were very, they thought that, sorry, I forgot the word, misogynist. Yeah, so their attitudes. Yeah, so they thought, well, women played a secondary role in the society. So anything related to them was not as important as the stuff related to men, because men were fighters and they were soldiers and they were breadwinners and everything. So if they engaged in homosexuality, that was a huge problem, yeah, because they didn't do any of these things, any of these important things that men were supposed to do. So yeah, the lack of lesbian visibility definitely played a role. And you see, I think that was a good thing, yeah, because if there had been a law criminalizing, female homosexuality, more people would have suffered, interestingly. But yes, that's what most historians think, yeah, the lack of visibility and the lack of knowledge on the part of Soviet secret police that lesbianism is a thing. So all of that made them think that such criminal sanctions were not necessary, basically. So yeah.
So that visibility, does it lead to Stalin and the secret police under the various leaders that you have across those 15 years, kind of
Yeah.
linking homosexual communities to anti-regime activities?
I think so, So I've recently written another book, and it's called There Was Sex, The Intimate Lives of Soviet People. And one of my reviewers, she said that sex was the only realm where people could feel, in the Soviet Union, where people could feel some freedom. And the government understood that, and they wanted to control that intimate part of their lives as well. So, homosexuality is something that many people still do not understand, do not accept, and so on. So, I can imagine that Soviet leaders, first of all, again, they didn't think about this issue at all. So when Stalin adopted sodomy laws, the subsequent leaders, they just went with it. They didn't question, the rationale, whether we need the law or not. They just kept it, and they didn't even look at it, and they didn't even want to hear. They didn't even want to listen to expert opinions, of scholars who were saying, "Hey, we've got this ugly law. We need to get rid of it." So they didn't think about it at all. That's why the law existed up until the end, up until 1993. So they didn't think about that. But yes, probably on some deep level, they had this fear of this thing, homosexual men. Who knows what they're doing there, So they engage in their perverse sex, and maybe they're, coming up with some like weird plans. Who knows? So all these, associations, probably came up in their heads if they ever thought about that. Yeah. And Stalin probably was the same. Yeah. He was paranoid. He was not familiar with the issue himself. Yeah. Even though Harry White, this brave Scottish man, wrote this huge letter to him telling him, hey, this is how men who want other men live. And they are not dangerous. They can be useful. They can be good communists. And Stalin still didn't want to listen to that because probably he had some entrenched views that people like that were perverts. Yeah, that people like that were dangerous. Yeah, so basically, they probably were paranoid. They probably thought that homosexual men were unreliable. They were easy targets for foreign intelligence services. Yeah, they were easy to blackmail. So all these things, they came together as a concept that homosexuality is something undesirable and it's something that threatens the state itself, on some deep level. So all these things, they came together in this concept. That's how I think. I mean, that was my impression. Yeah, that was my impression. Nobody explicitly, like in the sources that I found, nobody explicitly said, "Oh, homosexuality, is something that can, threaten our." No, actually, someone did. Yeah, but I mean, nobody talked about that at length. Yeah, but looking at things here and there, I came to that. Basically, I mean, I had this impression that that's what was happening.
I mean, it's really nice as a historian to be able to look through the sources and make those inferences because quite often these people don't write down what they're thinking on every
Yeah.
bit of paper. But then you were mentioning something really interesting there of Harry White and Khrushchev and subsequent leaders not changing policy because it's just there. Did anyone advocate for reform? And if so, what happened to them?
Yes, there were. Again, this is something that, I mean, most archives in Russia are now, historians won't be able to go there because of the war, because of the recent laws, and because many, many, many documents are still classified. But again, I found some books on jurisprudence and, legal scholars. So there were discussions about a possibility of getting rid of this law altogether. The first such discussion started in 1959. And so basically, when Stalin died, Khrushchev decided to review some of the most brutal laws and get rid of them. So to kind of like show that he's breaking with the past of Stalin's past of like repression and terror. And during one of those discussions, when legal scholars gathered at a table to discuss the laws, which laws should be thrown out and which laws should stay, they came across the article on sodomy. And I mean, in 1959, it was still scary and embarrassing and uncomfortable for most Soviet people to talk about sex, let alone homosexuality. And some of these scholars had the courage to say, hey, this law doesn't make sense. Let's get rid of it. And then there was another person, another legal scholar, a senior scholar, who said, yes, I agree with that. We should get rid of the first part, which criminalizes sex between consensual adults. And then all of a sudden, there was another person who said, no, we should not do that. Why do you want to do that? And then silence hang in the air. And they were just embarrassed to discuss it further. And the law just stayed. Yeah, so that was a chance to get rid of it. And the chance was lost. And then during throughout the 1960s and 70s, some scholars in their dissertations and books, they were expressing the view that, again, this sodomy law did not serve any real purpose, that it didn't make sense. Yeah. So if we have two consensual men engaging in sex, how do we establish that the crime had taken place? Yeah. Obviously, neither of them will denounce the other one. Yeah. And then also, what is the purpose of this law? Whom are we protecting here? So all these things were mentioned in some books on, on uh, in some books and pamphlets for legal scholars, for police officers. There were discussions and then when some of these scholars actually tried to take some action and some of them actually approached the Interior Ministry with this proposal to get rid of the law, they didn't receive any response from Russian officials. Simply, they were just ignored. Yeah, there was a risk for them as well. Yeah, imagine that in a country where there are sodomy laws and sex and homosexuality are taboo, and if you suddenly advocate for the rights of homosexual people, what others can think about you and what kind of reputation can you make for yourself? Yeah, and what can be the consequences of that? So they were running the risk of ruining their careers, and the risk was really serious. But they still did that. They were not doing it actively. Yeah, sometimes, now and again, they were mentioning that in their books. Yeah, I assume that there were discussions that were not recorded. Yeah, so I'm sure some of them wrote these proposals in their dissertations. Yeah, and they were even trying to defend these views in front of other scholars. But then again, as I wrote in Red Closet, some of them had to take their words back because, for example, the defense of their dissertation was in jeopardy. Yeah, so if they said no, homosexual men, still should not be considered criminals, then probably some of them, would have lost their privileged positions of scholars and would not have defended their dissertation. So there were many things at stake that made them think twice about what to say, when to say, and how. Yeah, and that's why I think not much progress was done. And even if they had been more insistent, if they had been more persistent, I think Soviet officials would not have, taken into consideration what they were saying. So, and that's what happened. Probably there were other attempts to approach Soviet officials, yeah, and they just probably ignored all these proposals, unfortunately.
And
Yeah,
I think that's the nature of those kind of regimes,
yeah,
really.
yeah.
And you see that kind of nature in other areas of Soviet political life. But then when you switch into how people are feeling, how people tried to deal with it, I found it quite interesting. Throughout the book, you discuss a form of conversion therapy that
hmm
some of these men went through. How did this kind of emerge? Why were they choosing to do this? And again, how did the regime feel about that?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So, first of all, this thing that I call aversion therapy, well, because that was in essence aversion therapy. Yeah, the medical treatment for homosexuality. It was not as widespread as it was in the United States or in the UK. So, in the Soviet Union, there was, at least, well, I think there was one doctor. His name is Jan Goland. He was probably the most prominent psychiatrist who was famous for his methods of treating homosexuals. So he was an interesting person. I think, so he was the one who advocated this method of treating homosexuality without medications, without any intrusive techniques. Yeah, so he believed that a homosexual man can convert himself into a heterosexual person by, repeating to himself certain phrases and by making himself focus all his attention on women rather than men. Yeah, that was an interesting sort of thing because in the West, psychiatrists, yeah, and psychotherapists wanted to do some sort of psychoanalysis. They wanted to find the roots of the homosexual desire. This doctor, Goland, he was not interested why his patients became homosexuals. He just wanted them to jump into action immediately. Yeah, so yes, he wanted to know their past histories. Yeah, when they felt their homosexual desire, how it developed. Yeah, whether they actually acted on it or not. Yeah, but he just wanted that information for to understand the context where his patients came from. Yeah, but he was proud that he used no medications. All his patients had to do was to do this suggesting, what is it called? Autosuggestion exercises, when you repeat to yourself a set of phrases, when you make yourself think about women, when you look at their pictures and photos and you fantasize and you imagine them in erotic settings. So all that kind of stuff was the essence of his treatment. And he was the only person who advocated for this method and who tried to popularize that method. This method, according to Goland, consisted of 3 steps. And other doctors in the Soviet Union knew, most psychiatrists, most sexologists knew about Goland. And whenever they encountered homosexual patients, they just referred them to him. And these men actually, made an effort, and they went to the city of Gorky where he resided, and they were hopeful that they would be treated. And the interesting thing is that the Russian police. So homosexuality was officially a crime. Male homosexuality was a crime. And Goland was trying to treat homosexual men. So technically, he was supposed to hand them over to the police, but he didn't. So he actually actively protected his patients. He assigned pseudonyms. Yeah, he did everything he could to make sure that nothing was disclosed and that police didn't know about anything about what he was doing. Yeah, and that was an interesting thing. Yeah, so on the one hand we have male homosexuality as a crime, and on the other hand we have doctors who believe that it's actually an illness. Yeah, and how does it work? There's a contradiction. Yeah, and how does it work? But it worked. Somehow it worked. Goland never ran into any troubles and problems with the police. None of his patients ended up, you know, uh, you know, in jail because they went to Goland. So somehow this dual sort of understanding of homosexuality persisted and continued until the end of the Soviet Union. Yeah, but there were not many doctors in the Soviet Union who actually tried to treat homosexuality, but Goland was one of them. He was the most prominent one. He was a very he was a very interesting person. He really loved fame. He loved the acknowledgement of his successful therapies, and he was really proud that he didn't make his patients, take any medications. Yeah, he didn't cause them any sort of physical suffering. Yeah, but obviously he caused them mental suffering. Yeah, so that is an interesting thing, and this is again something that I'm still trying to to do research on. Yeah, to see how come in a society like in a Soviet society these things lived together: the perception of homosexuality as a crime and the perception of homosexuality as a medical issue. So yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting avenue for my next question. Really, if they're dealing with homosexuality as a medical issue here with Goland and the states kind of not getting too involved, when the AIDS pandemic becomes a health issue across Russia, how
Mhm.
does the regime deal with that politically, socially, and medically as well? Because it's tying across so many different areas of the regime that the regime either didn't want to go or it tried too hard to get involved in.
Yeah. So basically, when the HIV pandemic started in the first cases were registered in 1982. So basically, when Soviet, the whole problem, yeah, that's a very interesting issue. So in 1982, first cases were registered in the US, yeah, then in some European countries. And during that time, the Soviet Union was not really concerned about AIDS and HIV. Most health officials thought that since, the USSR had sodomy laws, since allegedly prostitution didn't exist in Soviet society, and drug, addicts was also something that was alien to Soviet society, then the problem of AIDS was not going to affect the country. Yeah, they were, of course, wrong. Yeah, but initially, they were in that sort of denial. Yeah, this is not our problem. This is not going to happen. A bunch of queers got sick somewhere in the West. Why should we care? Yeah, we don't have homosexuals. We don't have prostitutes. Yeah, and even if we do have homosexuals, they will be dealt with, by the law. Yeah, with the law. Yeah, so everything is there. Everything is effective. So we're not going to do anything about that. But then there was some, rude awakening in 1989 when Soviet authorities suddenly realized that, you know, um, HIV/AIDS problem has come to the USSR, and it emerged in a place where nobody expected it to emerge, in a hospital for children. Yeah, and how did the outbreak happen? Well, several nurses used syringes several times. They administered the same drug using the same syringe to 250 infants, and all of them got infected all of a sudden. And then suddenly, Soviet government realized that it was not prostitutes, homosexuals, and drug addicts. Yeah, it was the dire state of Soviet healthcare that brought the virus. Yeah, that made it a problem. Yeah, that created these outbreaks. Yeah, so yes, initially the government decided to just turn a blind eye on that. And of course, there were tremendous political transformations in the USSR during that time. And all the government's attention obviously was directed to many other pressing issues, because there were so many other issues that had to be resolved immediately. And it's very unfortunate that during that time, AIDS and HIV pandemic was another complicating factor that the Soviet government had to deal with. Yeah, so it was an unfortunate mix and historical coincidence. Yeah, but again, the Soviet Union had a chance to see what was happening in other countries, yeah, and what other countries were doing to fight the pandemic. And the Soviet Union did nothing. I mean, obviously, some doctors who were aware of the virus, yeah, in the country, they did something, but that was not enough. There was no political will. There was no desire on the part of Soviet officials to do something about that. Most of them didn't even think that it was a problem. Even after the outbreaks, even after these mass infections of innocent children, most politicians basically thought about other things. Yeah, again, because there were many other things to think about. Even today, the issue of HIV in Russia is still something that is being actively ignored by officials. Yes, there is some funding. Yeah, there are some governmental programs, but the number of HIV positive people is growing. It's now more than 1 million, and it's growing even more because of the war. And the Russian government is definitely not interested in tackling the problem, unfortunately. Like, I think 2 weeks ago, Russian government introduced this new sort of initiative to allow people with syphilis to go to the war. Yeah, so now they don't even care. I mean, so if they kill their own people, why would they think about HIV? Yeah, so why would they care about something as that? Yeah, unfortunately. And again, that sort of attitude to the issue of AIDS, it's all rooted in the past. Yeah, and this is something that I talk about in my new book, which is called AIDS in Soviet Russia: A History of Deception, Despair, and Hope. So unfortunately, history is repeating itself again. Yeah, and yes, there are still these beliefs that among some doctors that AIDS and HIV are the things that are mainly characteristic of, undesirable strata of society. Yeah. So I think Russia is not unique in this regard, of course. Yeah, but yes, it definitely comes from that Soviet traditional thinking.
It's very interesting to see the long thread of history through the Soviets right through to how Putin's behaving. And you can see that thread through so many different strands, and adding another one through his treatment of LGBT people is, it just adds to that narrative of what's going on in Russia today and what has been going on in Russia since Putin came to power and before that. And I think now is probably the best time for a final fun question for you, Rustam.
Yeah.
Now, you've lived in Australia, you spent a lot of time there. I wanted to ask as a final fun question, what's your favourite thing about the country?
The weather. I like it. I like the weather. Honestly, look, I was born in Russia. We've got Russian winters, and in some regions, winters last like 6 months. Now I live in Sydney. God, I love it. The blue skies, the ocean, the weather, and the overall vibe. Everyone smiles, everyone is friendly. It's just beautiful. The sunsets, the weather. It's probably the best thing about Australia, honestly. And you appreciate it even more when you travel. I've never been to the UK. Yeah, I've been to Europe, of course, and I know that winters can be harsh and days can be gloomy. So that is an exception. I mean, most days in Australia are sunny, and the sky is blue mostly. I mean, maybe not in Melbourne, but in Sydney, yes. So that's what I love about Australia, and it's great to be there because it's a great place to write as well. Whenever you feel like you have no inspiration, you just go to Bondi Beach and you just open your laptop and you just write there, and it's just amazing.
I'm already incredibly jealous. It's been a horrible day here today.
You're welcome. You're welcome to come and visit, and maybe you can stay because I know that. I mean, look, there are many British people there, so I don't know what visa they are on, but they love it. They want to stay, and most of them stay.
I don't blame him from what you're saying there. Now, if our listeners want to go away and grab a copy of Red Closet: The Hidden History of Gay Oppression in the USSR, where can they go?
They actually don't need to go anywhere. They can just go on a website, Manchester University Press, and they can click. They can find the book there. They can, get it delivered. And I know that there are stores in London and other cities in the UK, and actually in some other European cities. But I think the best way is to order it online. Manchester University Press website. That's the easiest way to go and to do that.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure the link for that is in the description below. And then if people want to keep up to date with you, your other work, where can they go?
They can start following me on Twitter, or X as they call it today. I know that many academics have decided to leave it because of the whole thing happening now. But my Twitter is Ruskander, so it's Xander. You can probably leave it under the.
We will do.
That would be good, yeah. Or alternatively, they can. I'm planning to set up a website actually, because I actively write for Russian independent media and newspapers and platforms and stuff. So it would be good to put all these things in one place. So if there are people, interested in that, they can go to one place and read that.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure your X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it today is in the description below. But thank you very much for coming on, Rustam.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I'm really happy to talk about these things, and I'm really happy when more people learn about these things.
Now, thank you very much for listening to this latest episode of the History of Jackson podcast, where we spoke to Rustam Alexander all about his book, Red Closet: The History of Gay Oppression in the USSR. Now, this was a fascinating conversation. As a historian of totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, it was really interesting to look at a different perspective of the terror that occurred in the Soviet Union and how different groups were targeted within that terror. Now, if you were watching on YouTube, I do apologise that Rustam did not appear on video. He is unable to appear on video due to the sensitive nature of his work. But if you enjoyed this episode or any other content that we create here at History Jackson, please do consider heading to our Patreon or History Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us to continue to create the content that we create here on a daily basis. Now, next week, we've got another awesome episode lined up for you that I know you're going to enjoy. So do keep your eyes and ears peeled for that one.
Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.